While much of Europe was developing social democratic and Christian socialist parties influenced by Marxist ideas, Britain followed a different path. Rather than embracing Marxist politics, British workers helped create a distinctly British political movement, the Labour Party, which remains a major political force and has governed Britain on numerous occasions. Historically, British workers tended to avoid Marxism, and trade unions generally stayed out of politics, concentrating instead on collective bargaining and securing workplace reforms. The emergence of the Labour Party marked a significant change, but this shift was not driven by ideological commitment to Marxism. Instead, it arose in response to a specific legal crisis that threatened the very existence of British trade unions. Understanding this crisis is key to understanding how the Labour Party was born. Unlike the social democratic parties that emerged across continental Europe, the British Labour Party was never fundamentally Marxist in origin or purpose. It did not arise from Marxist theory, advocate revolution, seek the abolition of capitalism, or originate from the ideas of socialist philosophers. Instead, the Labour Party was created by trade unions to serve the interests of trade unions and to protect the rights of working people within Britain's existing political system. Its formation was driven less by ideology than by practical necessity. The immediate catalyst was the Taff Vale Decision, a landmark court ruling that threatened the legal and financial security of trade unions. Faced with the possibility that unions could be held liable for damages resulting from strikes, Labour leaders concluded that workers needed direct political representation in Parliament. As a result, they established what would become the Labour Party, not as a revolutionary socialist movement, but as a political vehicle to defend and advance the interests of organised labour. In 1901, Britain's courts issued a landmark ruling known as the Taff Vale Decision, which created a serious crisis for the trade union movement. The court held that if a union organised a strike, it could be held financially liable for the economic losses suffered by the employer. The consequences of this ruling were potentially devastating. A single unsuccessful strike could bankrupt an entire union, making industrial action an extremely risky strategy. Employers, meanwhile, would have little incentive to negotiate with workers, knowing that unions could face ruinous financial penalties if they resorted to strikes. Many labour leaders feared that the decision threatened the survival of trade unionism itself. Realising that the courts had effectively changed the rules under which they operated, unions concluded that their only hope lay in changing the law. In the British political system, the only way to overturn a court decision is through legislation passed by Parliament. As a result, workers recognised that they needed their own representatives in Parliament who could protect union rights and secure legal reforms. This realisation became a major driving force behind the creation of the Labour Party. In response to the crisis created by the Taff Vale Decision, Britain's major trade unions joined together to establish a new national political party, the Labour Party. The party's goals were practical rather than ideological. Its founders sought to elect representatives sympathetic to organised labour, repeal the Taff Vale ruling, and protect workers' rights through legislation. The strategy quickly proved effective. In the general election of 1906, Labour won 29 seats in Parliament. Although this was a relatively small number, it gave the party significant influence because neither of the two major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, could easily ignore its support. Labour therefore aligned with the Liberals in what became known as the Lib-Lab Alliance, using its parliamentary leverage to advance labour interests. Together, Labour and the Liberals succeeded in overturning the effects of the Taff Vale Decision, restoring legal protections for trade unions. However, this alliance did not limit itself to that single objective. It soon became the foundation for a broader programme of social and labour reforms that would reshape British politics in the years before the First World War. Between 1906 and 1914, the Liberals and Labour worked together in Parliament through the Lib-Lab Alliance to enact a series of significant social reforms that improved the lives of working-class Britons. Their legislation included minimum wage protections in certain industries, state-sponsored unemployment insurance, old age pensions, the removal of legal restrictions on trade unions, limits on working hours, and stronger factory safety regulations. These measures marked a growing acceptance of government responsibility for social welfare and labour protection. To finance these new programs, the coalition introduced a progressive income tax and an inheritance tax, policies designed to place a greater share of the tax burden on the wealthiest members of society. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, these reforms had transformed Britain's political landscape and laid many of the foundations of the modern welfare state, demonstrating how cooperation between Labour and the Liberals could produce far-reaching social change. By the early 20th century, Britain appeared to challenge one of Karl Marx's central predictions about class solidarity. Marx had argued that workers would ultimately identify more strongly with their shared class interests than with their national loyalties, famously suggesting that workers across national borders would recognize common interests against their employers. However, when the First World War broke out in 1914, British workers overwhelmingly volunteered for military service and supported the war effort. Rather than viewing German workers as fellow members of an international working class, most British workers identified primarily with their nation, communities, families, and government. This response suggested that national identity could be a more powerful force than class consciousness. Moreover, many workers felt they had a stake in British society because political reforms and labour legislation had improved their lives in the years leading up to the war. The expansion of trade union rights, the introduction of social welfare programs, and increasing political representation through the Labour Party convinced many workers that change could be achieved within the existing system. As a result, by 1914, large numbers of British workers supported and defended the British state rather than seeking the class-based revolutionary movement that Marx had predicted. Their rising expectations were increasingly being met through higher wages, shorter working hours, better working conditions, greater political representation, and expanding social protections. Although strikes still occurred, they were generally driven by workers' desire for further improvements rather than by hostility toward the economic system itself. By 1914, many workers believed they had a meaningful stake in their societies and nations, which helps explain why so many were willing to fight for their countries when war broke out.